And thank you for choosing to spend this portion of your evening with me. I'd like to start this talk by asking you a question. How many of you here have been in a situation where you've had a decision to make? You felt like you knew the answer, and then you talk yourself out of it, and you make a different decision, and then kick yourself for not following your first impulse. Can anyone here relate to that? Well, there's a word that's associated with that sense of inner knowing, and that word is intuition. And tonight we're going to talk about intuition so that we can learn about it and use it to make better decisions for ourselves, both personally and professionally. Over the history of humankind, intuition has been associated primarily with mysticism, spirituality, and theology. It wasn't until the 1890s that Sigmund Freud declared that intuition was actually unconscious communication, or communication from the unconscious. It would take neuroscientists approximately 120 years to prove that Sigmund Freud was correct. Today, intuition is much more prevalent in our society. Businesses use it as a buzzword to catch the attention of the consumer. Today we have intuition razors, intuition snack food, intuition powdered drinks. Estee Lauder makes a perfume called Intuition. And thanks to the late Steve Jobs, we now have something that we can relate to called intuitive technology. More recently, the Ford Motor Company has been marketing their new Lincoln Town Car, as the most intuitive experience you'll ever have behind the wheel. So what does this all mean? And how do we use intuition so that we can make the best decisions for ourselves? Well, in order to understand and resolve these questions, we need to understand the structure of the mind. Now, imagine an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg represents 5% of the total mass of the object. The other remaining 95% is submerged underwater. Now, the tip of the iceberg represents the conscious mind. And beneath the surface, the remaining of the structure is called the unconscious mind. Now, the conscious mind is where we do all of our problem solving. And it's also responsible, it's where we do our abstract thinking. It is laser sharp. It is brilliant, but it is also quite limited. The conscious mind can only absorb approximately 100 bits of information per second amongst the billions of bits that it's exposed to consistently. The unconscious mind can absorb approximately 1,000 bits of information per second, and it is excellent at putting relevant pieces of information together and detecting patterns. When the unconscious mind detects a pattern, or if a pattern is off, or if a piece of information is missing, it sends a message through the body via the nervous system. And that's why we feel these things in our guts, these gut-like sensations. The gut having the second highest concentration of neurons in the body, second only to the brain. Sometimes the unconscious sends messages directly into the consciousness. And when that happens, that's when we have these aha moments, these aha type experiences. In fact, the definition of intuition is information that arrives instantly into consciousness, bypassing the reasoning process. And when it arrives, it's, as I mentioned before, associated with either a gut feeling or other physical sensations that we're going to talk about in a moment. Now, just to expand a little bit on these aha experiences, I want to talk for a minute about the movie Match Point, directed by Woody Allen. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. But the film is about a detective who's trying to solve a murder, and he's one of England's finest detectives. And despite gathering all of the clues and information available, he can't figure out who done it. There's one scene in the film a little bit later on where we find the detective laying in bed, and suddenly he shoots out of bed and looks at the camera and says, "I know who did it!" This is a very important and realistic part in this movie, because what the director is showing us is a very effective problem-solving technique, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. Going back to the unconscious. When the unconscious detects that a pattern is off or that information is missing, it does send a message to the body. But the kind of message that comes from the unconscious feels like what I call an alarm-type experience. And there are different levels of alarm-type experience. A low-level alarm-type experience feels like this. You walk into a room, or you meet somebody for the first time, or you meet somebody that you know, or you're about to do some business with someone, and you get this feeling in your stomach that says, there's something not quite right about this situation. Something's off. I don't know what it is, I can't put my finger on it, but something's not quite right. The thing to remember about alarm-type sensations is that very often it isn't until after the fact that you'll understand what that feeling represented at the time. And that gives you this wonderful opportunity to say, I knew there was something wrong about that. You know, I knew that. I knew there was something wrong. A high-level alarm-type experience is a feeling that invokes immediate action. And I want to tell you a story that'll illustrate my point. And this is a true story about a Formula One racing car driver who was a very seasoned driver. And he was in his vehicle about to approach a hairpin turn just before reaching the finish line. And a hairpin turn is a very abrupt, a very quick turn. Just before approaching this turn, rather than go into it, he slams on the brakes and he pulls his car over to the side. And in his mind at that moment, he's forfeiting the race. Now what he didn't know at that moment was that at the other side of this turn, there was a multi-car pile. And had he gone through this hairpin turn, he certainly would have been part of that pile. In fact, most likely, he would have lost his life. About 3 weeks later, this driver and some behavioral psychologists got together to watch the video on what happened. They wanted to find out what was it that clued him to making this decision and save his life. So they watched this video together, and what the driver realized was that the crowd that normally would have been cheering him on and shouting out his name wasn't focused on him, but focused, actually watching in horror what was happening at the crash site. And while he couldn't process this information in the moment, unconsciously he recognized that a pattern was off. And that was enough to make him pull the stop, pull his car over, save his life. Now, there are lots of alarm-level intuition stories like this, but what I'd like to do is to summarize this talk by giving you some tools that you can use to enhance and engage your intuition right away. The first tool is befriend your body. What this tool implies is pay attention to the physiological changes that happen inside of you. Pay attention to your heart rate. Learn to see, are your palms sweating? And if so, ask yourself why. Has your breathing become labored? Do you feel a knot in the pit of your stomach? Or do you notice that your muscles are tense? Just become aware of this tension that you're carrying. The reason why I suggest this is that the more in tune you become with your body, with these physiological responses, the more intuitive you will become. Does that make sense? Okay. The next tool that I want to speak about is called take a hike. Now, if you remember a few moments ago, I was talking about that Woody Allen movie. The take a hike tool is a reference to putting some separation between you and a problem. The next time you have a very complex problem to solve, after you've gathered all of the information, if the answer to your problem isn't apparent, then I encourage you to step away from your problem. Put some space between you and your problem. Because what this will do is it will deactivate your conscious mind and create the space for your unconscious mind to do the hard work and provide an answer for you. And if it doesn't provide an answer in the time that you need it to, then I encourage you to just go with your first impulse. Research has shown over and over again that it's the first impulse that's usually the most correct. And finally, I want to mention to you this tool of developing expert intuition. Expert intuition is what occurs as you become more familiar with the patterns that are experienced in your chosen field. As you become more familiar with these patterns, your thought process will quicken. You will become, as you become an expert in your field, your knowledge that you have cognitively will transform into intuitive knowledge. And that type of knowledge increases your speed and perception. I want to mention to you this interview that Wayne Gretzky gave not long ago in a magazine. And this reporter asked Wayne, what was it that made him, the best NHL player of all time? What was it that separated him from every other player that came before him? And his response was, I skated not to where the puck was, but to where the puck was going to be. See, he knew the patterns in that ice rink, cold. Able to develop, he's a beautiful example of someone working with expert intuition. And I put it to you that everyone here has the ability to become this, an expert, a Gretzky in your own field. The challenge that you have is finding your own version of it and becoming it.